The message came through at 11:52 on a Saturday night while I was standing in the hotel hallway, still holding the plastic cup of sparkling cider from my brother's graduation dinner. It was a balance alert from my bank, the kind you set up specifically because you're the type of person who needs to know the moment something large moves. The number on the screen was 0. Not close to 0. Not lower than expected. 0. I read it once, and then I went back inside the banquet room and watched my father toast my brother's name and laugh at something my uncle said. And I stood there with the empty cup, and I didn't say a word to anyone. My name is Claire. I'm 29 years old. I've been a registered nurse for 6 years and a nurse practitioner for 2. I work at a hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, and for the past 4 years, I have been doing what people in my family describe as doing well for yourself, which, in the language of where I come from, means something specific. It means you have become a resource. I want to explain something before I tell you the rest. My family is not unusual in the ways that matter. They are not cold people. My mother makes the best biscuits I have ever eaten in my life. My father coached my brother's Little League team for 4 years without missing a single Saturday. We took road trips every summer until I was 16. I say this because I want you to understand that what happened to me was not the result of a family that didn't love me. It was the result of a family that had never developed a language for where love ends and entitlement begins. I am the oldest of 3. There is my brother Marcus, who just graduated with a degree in business from a university in Nashville that cost more than either of my parents made in a combined year. And there is my sister Petra, who is 22 and finishing her last year of cosmetology school. I am the one who left home at 18 on a scholarship and didn't look back. Not because I didn't love them, but because I understood early that staying close meant staying small. My parents raised Marcus the way people raise the child they think will redeem everything. He was the first son. He was charming in a way that made people forgive him for things they would hold against anyone else. He was also 22 years old and had never paid a single bill in his life. The graduation was in Nashville. 3 days at a hotel downtown, a dinner Friday, the ceremony Saturday afternoon, a brunch Sunday morning. I paid for my own room, which no one acknowledged, and I bought Marcus a watch as a gift that cost more than I said when people asked. That was the kind of thing I did. Not because anyone thanked me for it, but because there was a version of me that still believed if I gave enough, the debt would eventually feel settled. It never did. The trouble started Thursday afternoon, the day I arrived. My father called me while I was still in the parking garage of the hotel, luggage still in the trunk of my car. He said it casually, the way he says things that are not casual at all. He said he was having a problem with the card he'd brought for the weekend. A freeze, he said. Something had flagged on the account when he'd crossed state lines, which he said happens sometimes, and the bank was being difficult about lifting it remotely. He just needed a backup, he said, just in case anything came up with payments over the weekend. He wasn't asking for money, he said. Just access. Just temporarily. Just so there was a safety net in case the restaurants or the hotel had a problem with cash. I want to tell you what I felt when he said that, because I think it matters. I felt the thing I always felt when my father asked me for something, which was a very specific kind of tired. Not angry, not alarmed, just tired, the way you get tired of a conversation you have been having in one form or another for most of your adult life. But it was my brother's graduation weekend. My father sounded genuinely frustrated about the card situation. And I was standing in a parking garage with luggage at my feet, and I told myself the same thing I had been telling myself since I was 23, that saying no to something small would cost more in family damage than it was worth. I added him to my checking account from my phone in the parking garage. The verification code came through, and I read it to him out loud, because he said he'd left his reading glasses in the car. He thanked me. He said he'd have the freeze sorted out by Monday. I said okay, and I went inside and checked into my room, and I did not think about it again until Saturday night. $68,412. That was what was in my account when I added my father to it on Thursday. That was 4 years of extra shifts, of saying no to vacations, of living in an apartment with 1 bedroom and no dishwasher because everything else went into savings. $68,000 was my down payment on a house in East Memphis, in a neighborhood called Evergreen, where I had already walked through a 2-bedroom with a back porch and a kitchen window that faced west and caught the afternoon light in a way that made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, like I was about to be somewhere. I did not cry when I saw the 0. I want to be honest about that the way I try to be honest about everything now. What I felt was not grief, not exactly. It was more like recognition, the feeling you get when something you suspected for a long time finally stops being a suspicion and becomes a fact. I put my phone in my pocket. I went back inside the banquet room. I watched my father hug my brother and my mother take 17 photographs, and I stayed until a reasonable time, and then I said I had a headache and I went upstairs to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. I went through my account activity on my phone until I found the transfer. It had gone to an account I didn't recognize a routing number from a bank in Alabama. 2 transfers, actually. One at 4:17 inches the afternoon and one at 9:03 that evening. Together, they were the entirety of what I had. I took a screenshot of both. I wrote the reference numbers in the Notes app on my phone because I didn't trust myself to remember anything accurately that night. Then I called the bank. It was after midnight and I was connected to the overnight line, and I explained the situation as clearly as I could to a representative who was patient and careful and walked me through exactly what I needed to do to initiate a fraud investigation. I said the account had been accessed by someone I had added as a joint holder. I said the transfers were not authorized by me. I said I wanted everything documented and a case number issued before I ended the call. She gave me 3 reference numbers and the direct line for the fraud escalation team and told me to call back first thing in the morning when the relevant department opened. I thanked her. I hung up. I set an alarm for 7 and I went to sleep, which I think surprised me more than anything else about that night. I just went to sleep, not because I wasn't upset, not because I didn't understand what had happened, but because there was nothing more I could do before morning, and I had a ceremony to sit through at noon, and I had been a nurse long enough to know that the body needs sleep, even when the mind has decided sleep is not allowed. Sunday morning, I woke up before my alarm. I called the fraud department at 7:03 and spent 40 minutes on the phone going through every detail I had. The representative confirmed that the transfers had been initiated through the joint access credentials, and that while the authorization had been technically valid based on the account structure, the fraudulent misrepresentation used to obtain that access was a documented basis for a civil recovery claim. She told me to preserve all records of how the access had been granted. She told me the investigation would take a minimum of 60 days. She told me to consult an attorney. I wrote all of it down. At 10:30, I went downstairs to the graduation brunch. My father was at the buffet when I arrived, loading his plate with eggs. He looked rested. He smiled when he saw me and asked how my headache was. I told him it was better. I sat down across from my mother and I ate something, and I answered questions about work, and I smiled at the right moments, and I waited. At some point during the meal, when the table was noisy enough that a quiet conversation would not carry, I leaned slightly toward my father and I said, "I checked my account this morning." He kept cutting his food. He said, "Yeah, I meant to call you about that." He set his fork down. He looked at the table rather than at me, and then he told me, it was not a short explanation. The version of events my father offered was long and detailed and full of the specific language people use when they have been rehearsing something. He had borrowed money, borrowed, not taken. That was the word he used 6 times in the first 4 minutes from 2 men he had been doing business with for the past 3 years. A side venture, he called it. A distribution arrangement that had hit a temporary cash flow problem. These men had given him a deadline. The end of the month. He needed to show good faith. He had intended to tell me. He had been trying to find another way. When the opportunity presented itself this weekend, when he was already added to my account and the transfer took less than 30 seconds, he had made a decision that he knew was wrong and that he was sorry for and that he would fix. He said I would be paid back every cent. He said it in the tone of a man who believes that saying a thing makes it true. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the house in Evergreen. I thought about the afternoon light in the kitchen. I thought about the lease I was planning to give notice on in October, the boxes I had already started mentally packing. I thought about a conversation we'd had when I was 24, when I had first mentioned I was saving seriously, and he had put his hand on my shoulder and said he was proud of me, and I had believed him completely. "I understand," I said. And then I picked up my glass and finished my orange juice, and I excused myself from the table, and I went back upstairs, and I spent the rest of Sunday morning making a list of every attorney in the Memphis area who handled civil fraud and financial recovery cases. I want to tell you about the attorney I found, because she matters to this story. Her name was Diane Okafor. She had an office in Midtown Memphis, and she had been practicing civil litigation for 21 years, and when I walked into her office on Tuesday with a folder full of bank statements and screenshots and the notes I had taken from 3 separate phone calls, she looked at everything without saying anything for a long time, and then she looked at me and said, "This is more recoverable than you think." What I didn't know at the time was that my father's situation was not a recent problem. It was an old problem that had been getting larger for several years in the way that quiet problems do when no one names them out loud. The men he owed money to were not associates. They were investors, 8 of them. Diane eventually helped me discover, not two who had given my father money over the course of 5 years for a distribution business that existed in documentation, but operated mostly as a mechanism for moving other people's money into my father's accounts, long enough to pay off other debts before the next shortfall arrived. It was not sophisticated. It did not need to be, because the people who trusted him personally, the way people trust men who coach their sons in Little League. My mother knew more than she initially claimed. The transfers had not been improvised. My father had logged into my account from a device in their hotel room at 4 in the afternoon, when I was downstairs at the pre-graduation reception, and then again at 9 in the evening from the same device. There was a record. Diane had seen records like this before. The weeks after Nashville were not easy in the way that you might expect when you know you have a case, when you know the outcome is likely to be in your favor. Knowing you are probably going to be okay and actually being okay are different conditions, and I lived in the space between them for about 3 months. My father called me 9 times in the first 2 weeks. I sent every call to voicemail. Some of the messages were apologetic in the way of a man who is sorry he was caught. Some of them were frustrated, as though I had done something unreasonable by consulting an attorney, as though taking legal steps to recover $68,000 from someone who had stolen it while I slept down the hall was an overreaction. One message was just silence for 45 seconds and then the sound of him putting the phone down. I saved that one. I don't know why. My mother called me once. Her message was 12 minutes long and I only made it through 4 minutes before I had to stop. She did not apologize. She explained, "There is a difference." She explained the pressure my father had been under, the people he owed, the embarrassment of the situation, the fact that I was young and employed and in good health and that the family needed to come first. She used the word family 11 times in 4 minutes. I counted. I did not call her back. What I want to tell you about is the phone call from my sister Petra. She called me on a Thursday night in week 3. I almost didn't answer because I wasn't sure what I was going to walk into, whether she had been sent as a messenger, whether she was going to ask me to drop things, whether the call was going to be another version of the conversation I had already refused to have. But I answered, and for a moment neither of us said anything. And then she said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you sooner." She said that the previous spring, 8 months before the graduation, 8 months before I was standing in a parking garage in Nashville adding my father to my account, he had called her with the same story. The frozen card, the state line, the temporary backup. She had been about to agree. She had already pulled up her banking app. And then something made her hesitate. She said she didn't know exactly what. Just a feeling. Just the particular quality of how practiced the explanation sounded. And she had told him her phone was acting up and she couldn't get the verification code to come through. She had stalled for 2 days until he stopped asking. She said, "I didn't tell you because I thought it was over. I thought if I said no long enough, he'd figure something else out. I thought I was protecting you by not making it a bigger thing. I know that was wrong. I'm sorry, Claire. I'm so sorry." I sat down on my kitchen floor. My back was against the cabinet under the sink, and I had my knees pulled up and the phone pressed to my ear, and I cried in a way I had not cried once during any of the previous 3 weeks. Not when I saw the 0 on my screen. Not when my father told me at the brunch table. Not when I laid in the hotel bed at midnight running through reference numbers in my head. I cried when my sister told me she had been quietly carrying the weight of almost knowing for 8 months and had been too scared to hand it to me, because that was the moment I understood we were both children of the same family and had both been trying, in our separate ways, to manage what we could not name. She came to Memphis the following weekend. We ordered Thai food and sat on my couch, and she told me everything. She remembered conversations she had overheard, a phone call she had walked in on, the way my father would sometimes disappear into his office for an hour after dinner and come back with the specific look of a man who had just made a problem slightly smaller for tonight. She gave me dates, names she recognized, details that she had stored away without knowing she was storing them, because that is what you do when you grow up in a house where questions are not welcome. You learn to hold information quietly until you have somewhere safe to put it. It helped Diane build a fuller picture. It helped the bank's fraud investigation establish a pattern. And it helped me, in a way that had nothing to do with the legal case, to stop feeling like I had done something stupid. The civil case was resolved 6 months after Nashville. My parents' attorney advised settlement once the full scope of documentation was assembled, and I think the decision was made easier for them by the fact that the district attorney in the county where my father had been operating had also opened a preliminary inquiry based on complaints from 3 of his investors. I was not part of that process. I gave a written statement once, and Diane handled the rest. The settlement required full repayment of the $68,000, plus my legal costs, secured by a lien on my parents' property, with a structured payment schedule enforced through the court. I did not attend any of the proceedings. I had already taken 5 days off work for consultations and document reviews, and I had patients who needed me. And I had made a decision early on that I was not going to spend one more day of my life in a room organized around my parents' choices. I tracked the case through Diane. I received updates by email. That was enough. The first repayment installment arrived on a Wednesday morning in March, while I was charting between appointments. I saw the notification, noted the amount, made sure it matched the schedule, and then went into my next exam room because my patient was already waiting and she had a complicated medication history, and she deserved my full attention. I want to tell you about the house I did not buy, because I think the story requires it. The 2-bedroom in Evergreen sold while my case was still in process. I drove by once, a few weeks after the sale closed, and there were window boxes on the front porch with something green and flowering in them, and a dog toy on the front steps. I sat in my car for longer than I probably needed to, not because I was devastated. I was further from devastated than I expected to be. I think what I had wanted was not that specific house, but what the house represented to me, the first thing I had built entirely from my own work, that no one could qualify, or condition, or take without my knowing. The idea that I could choose something and keep it. The house I found next was in Cooper Young, a little smaller, a little older, with a front porch that needed some work and a yard that needed more. The kitchen was dark and the pipes had opinions. But the neighborhood felt like something that was actually alive. Dog walkers in the morning, a farmer's market 3 blocks away on Saturdays, my neighbor on the left, who brought me tomatoes from her garden in August and told me she had lived on this street for 31 years and intended to die on it. I made an offer in April. I closed in June. I moved in on a Saturday with Petra and 2 friends from work and a rented van. My parents were not there. That was not an accident, and it was not cruelty. It was just the boundary I had decided on, quietly and without announcement, because some decisions don't need to be argued. They just need to be made. I painted the front door myself. The original color had been a dull red that had faded to something tired and uncertain. I spent 40 minutes in the paint aisle of the hardware store going through swatches, and I came home with a color called Midnight Teal, a deep blue-green that looks almost black in low light and catches the afternoon sun in a way that makes it look like something from a different world entirely. My neighbor from across the street came over while I was painting and said it was the best color on the block. I thanked her and kept painting and felt, for the first time in longer than I could track, completely at home inside my own life. People ask me, in the way that people ask when they've heard this story and need to make sense of it, whether I regret taking legal action against my own family. I understand the question. I have asked it of myself more than once, in the particular way you interrogate decisions that are already done, turning them over to see if there is something you missed. Here is what I know. My father made a plan. It was not impulsive. He drove to Nashville with a story prepared. He waited until I was in a parking garage, still road-tired, still in the logistical blur of a family weekend, and he delivered the story in the tone of a man who has told it before. When I added him to my account, he did not hesitate. He transferred the money in 2 installments over 6 hours. He went to the graduation dinner. He toasted his son. He slept. My mother knew enough to know that when I confronted my father on Sunday morning, the word she needed to use was borrowed. She had coached the language, if not the act. These were not the actions of people overcome by desperation. They were the actions of people who had looked at me and calculated, correctly based on years of experience, that I was the safest person to take from, because I was responsible enough to have the money and, they believed, too loyal to do anything about it. I was supposed to be a renewable resource, someone who refilled quietly and never asked for the accountability that other relationships required. I love my father. I want to say that without caveats, because it is true and because the truth of it does not excuse anything and does not require me to minimize anything. I love my father the way you love someone who taught you things and hurt you with the same hands. That kind of love does not disappear. It just changes what it costs you to carry it. Petra came for Thanksgiving. We cooked together in my new kitchen, which has a window over the sink that I've learned faces exactly the right direction in the late afternoon. She brought wine and a playlist and the particular energy she has always had of making a room feel like it's been warm for hours. We talked about everything except our parents. And then we talked about them too, because that's what happens when you have a shared history. You can't quite hold it entirely away from you, and at some point you stop wanting to. We didn't resolve anything. We named things and fed each other and cleaned up together and sat on my porch afterward in the November cold and watched the street go quiet. I still work early shifts. Not because my schedule requires it, but because there is something I find irreplaceable about a hospital before the day builds up the specific quality of the hallways. At 6 in the morning, The way the light is still gray and the pace is still deliberate, and everything feels like it is operating at the level of pure necessity. I became a nurse because I wanted to do something that was structurally honest, where the effort and the outcome were directly connected, where what I put in could not be taken and redirected somewhere I couldn't see. 6 years in, I still believe in the work that way. There is an accounting in it that I trust. I kept the screenshot of the zero balance, not the transfer records, not the case documents, those are filed and stored appropriately. But that one screenshot, the one I took in the hotel room at midnight when my hands were steadier than I expected them to be. I think there is something important about keeping the record of the things you have been through, not to stay inside them, but because evidence of what you survived is also evidence of what you are made of now. And those two things are the same? My neighbor asked me recently why I picked such a dramatic color for the door. I told her I didn't want to restore what was already there. I wanted to put something new on it, something that was entirely a choice I made for reasons that had nothing to do with what anyone else expected. She said she thought that was a fine reason for anything. I think so too. If you are watching this and something in it sounds familiar, the way a family can love you genuinely and still treat your stability like something they have a right to withdraw from, the specific weight of loyalty that becomes an obligation before you're old enough to consent to it, the moment you realize that the people who raised you have been counting on you to absorb the cost of their decisions. I want to say this clearly and without softening it. Protecting what is yours is not selfishness. Consulting an attorney when someone steals $68,000 from you is not cruelty. Sitting in a rental car after a family brunch and spending 2 hours making methodical phone calls is not coldness. It is the most honest form of self-respect. You are allowed to stop being the person in your family who pays for everything and accounts for nothing. You are allowed to let the consequences of other people's choices land on them instead of you. And you are allowed to paint your front door whatever color you want, on a street where no one knows your parents' names, in a home that belongs to you entirely and in every way that matters. If any part of this stayed with you, I'd really like to know which part. Leave it in the comments. I read all of them. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, please send it to them.